Shannon, can you do me a favor? Could you go up to my closet? I need a magnifying glass. I can't seem to make out the fine print on this map.
Okay.
Yeah. And my great-great-great-great-grandfather used to have one of those.
Where'd you get this one?
Oh, souvenirs from the past. You know, when I was a little boy, I used to be really good at playing that. Every time I'd pick it up and play it, it'd come right back at me and tell me a story.
What kind of story?
Well, a story about our great land and the people that made it that way.
How does it tell stories?
Well, first you got to play it, and then you have to listen, and then you'll start to hear things. Okay, now you remember to put all that stuff away when you get done with it, okay?
Okay. Did you hear that, Dad?
Hear what?
Yeah, here we go. Oh, don't you worry about them cannons over there. They're far off as the crow flies. Hey, thanks for finding my fife. I do appreciate a good tune now and again.
Where am I?
I reckon about 8 miles outside of Boston as the crow flies. Oh, you're not from around here, are you? Well, I'd recognize you if and you were.
Who are you?
Why, Benjamin Tucker's the name. Woodsman, trapper, trader, Indian wrestler, sometimes Minuteman, but all the time, American.
I'm lost.
Oh, don't you fret, little lady. Old Ben will look after you, catch you up on what's going on around these parts. Being as you're not from around here, why, we're about to have a war. A war for freedom.
Freedom?
Oh, Lordy, where do I start? During the early days of the American colonies, the British king made some of the laws which were passed by the British Parliament. The Parliament was made up of leaders elected by the people of Britain to speak for them. They made the laws for all the British people, including the colonies. Colonists, that being people living in the colonies, well, they weren't allowed to vote in the British election. They also couldn't elect leaders to speak and act for them in Parliament. Since the colonists' lives were very different from the British, the colonists thought they should have a self-government where they would be able to make their own laws. Eventually, as the colonies developed in the 16 and 1700s, the king and Parliament let the colonists make some of the laws that affected them. The population of these colonies grew quite a bit during the 1700s. The government in the British colonies became more like a democracy, which is when the people take part in the decision-making of the government, rather than a king making all the decisions. Parliament, though, why, they still had to approve the laws the colonists made, and the colonists still had to obey the laws made by Parliament. In time, every colony set up its own government and began making its own laws. People began to serve in legislatures, which were like small local parliaments. These legislatures, well, they made most of the decisions. Each colony did have a royal governor. Now, these governors made sure the laws that the colonial legislatures made were ones the British government would agree to. The governor in each colony also made sure the colonists obeyed the laws passed in Britain. For many years, the British colonists ruled themselves without problems. In 1753, the French in Canada began building forts on lands in the Ohio River Valley. Well, that's an area claimed by both France and Britain. Eventually, this caused a war, and in 1755, the British fought the French over that land. The British government, well, they sent its army to fight what came to be called the French and Indian War. Both the French and British had help from various tribes in the area, but it was the British and their Indian friends, mostly the Iroquois, who were victorious over the French in 1763. The British, well, they gained French lands in North America between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, and French Canada became a British colony. Well, the British won the war, but it cost a lot of money. The British citizens, well, they refused to pay for a colony war, so King George said the colonies would have to pay half. Well, the colonies would also have to pay to keep soldiers in the new territory won from the French. The colonists, they agreed to this plan, but many were angry about it. In time, King George and the British Parliament created the Proclamation of 1763. Now, this proclamation was to re-establish royal control over the colonies. This proclamation, or law, it ordered the colonists off the new lands won in the last war, saying that these lands were reserved for the Indians. The king, well, he also gave his colonial governors greater control over the colonies. The colonies were allowed to keep their legislatures, but the governor could order the legislatures to change the laws he did not like. Now, this angered the colonists, and loyalty to the British was starting to break down. Well, it just weren't fair, I tell you. I had some fine land at the base of them Appalachians. Fought long and hard for it, too.
What happened then?
Well, seeing that we colonists had to pay a heap for that war and got nothing from it, you can imagine we were a bit hot in the britches. We didn't have much of a voice in making our own decisions either. And to make it worse, the British started to push the colonists some more, just to show the colonists who was on top of the heap. In order to pay for these goods, the colonists sold local goods, such as furs, fish, and wood, and tobacco, rice, wheat, corn, and cattle. Soon, new taxes began to arise without the consent of the colonists. One reason was to pay for the French and Indian War. The other was to show that Britain still had a tight hold on the colony. Colonists, well, they found themselves having to buy many goods from the British. Goods such as sugar and molasses, paper, glass, lead, paint, and tea. Now, the Sugar Act of 1764, it said that the colonists must pay a tax on many basic goods, like sugar that came to the colonies from other places. And then there was the Stamp Act of 1765 that said that almost everything written or printed on paper in the colonies had to have a special stamp on it to show that a tax had been paid. So, one colonist, James Otis, he asked the colonists not to buy paper goods that had been stamped and that they should refuse to pay taxes. He claimed that the tax was taxation without representation, meaning the colonists had no say in what taxes they had to pay. Another colonist, Patrick Henry, he convinced the Virginia legislature to vote against new taxes. King George III, he paid little attention to the letters and petitions the colonists sent asking him to change the Stamp Act. So, in response, the colonists protested in various ways. In the Massachusetts colony, the Sons and Daughters of Liberty was formed. Liberty means freedom. In this case, liberty meant the freedom to make their own laws. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty, they asked people to boycott or to refuse to buy any British goods. They encouraged people to make their own goods. In some instances, the Sons of Liberty protested in more violent ways, such as attacks on the homes of tax collectors and other royal officials. Then, in 1765, People who felt the colonies should work together instead of acting separately, they got together for a meeting in New York City. This meeting was called the Stamp Act Congress. A Congress is a meeting of representatives who have the authority to make decisions. 9 colonies sent representatives to the Stamp Act Congress. They discussed the problems the new tax laws had caused and decided to ask people in all the colonies to refuse to buy stamped goods. Parliament heard about the Stamp Act Congress and repealed or canceled the Stamp Act. And this meant that the Stamp Act was no longer a law. Why, I was there at that meeting.
You were?
Yes, ma'am. Sent old King George a message. But more important was that we all got together to solve our problems. Colonists from all over.
Sounds like you were starting to make your own decisions.
Well, little miss, little lady, it weren't that easy. In 1767, the Parliament passed new laws called the Townshend Acts. These new laws affected trade in the colonies, taxing only imported goods and not goods produced in the colonies. By passing these new laws, the British government wanted to show that it could still make laws over the colonists. Parliament also sent soldiers to North America, and by 1770, there were more than 9,000 British soldiers in the 13 colonies. The colonists were told that the soldiers were there to protect the far-off western lands won in the French and Indian War. But the soldiers, well, they were in the cities all along the eastern coast. Having the soldiers in their towns angered many of the colonists. The soldiers were like an unnecessary police force. And some colonists, they even threw rocks at the soldiers and called them names like redcoats and bloody backs, making fun of their red uniforms. Then the British soldiers paid them back by destroying colonial property and doing other damage, such as riding their horses through churches. And then on March 5th, 1770, some colonists shouted insults at a group of soldiers and began to throw rocks and snowballs. Then the soldiers opened fire, killing 3 colonists. This was called the Boston Massacre. A massacre being the killing of a number of people who cannot defend themselves. The soldiers who killed the colonists were found not guilty by reason of self-defense, even though the colonists were not armed with guns. In the months following the Boston Massacre, King George still did not respond to the reports and petitions from the colonies. So the colonists decided to act on their own. Since the Stamp Act Congress had shown that the colonists could work together, Samuel Adams set up a committee of correspondence in Boston in November of 1772. He asked other cities and towns to do the same. The committees, well, they wrote letters to one another. These letters told what was being done in their colonies to protest the latest British laws. The letters were delivered by riders on horseback. Parliament repealed the Townshend Acts, but it kept the tax on tea. And then Parliament passed another new law in 1773 allowing a British company to sell tea in the colonies for a very low price. Now this would hurt the colonial merchants because less people would buy tea from them. Also, the colonists would still have to pay a tax on tea. People in every colony decided to boycott British tea, even though the price was lower. So, in Pennsylvania and New York, colonists didn't allow ships carrying British tea to enter their ports. In Massachusetts, however, the ship captains refused to be turned away and sailed right on into Boston Harbor. Late one night in December of 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty, disguised as Mohawk Indians, well, they boarded these tea ships. They broke open all the chests of tea and dumped the tea into the harbor. This was called the Boston Tea Party. Parliament, well, they was furious and decided to punish the colony of Massachusetts. They passed a law saying that no ship carrying colonial goods could leave Boston Harbor until the colonists had paid for all the tea that had been destroyed. And to enforce the new law, Parliament ordered the Royal Navy to blockade the Boston Harbor. A blockade meant that the colonists could not sell their goods outside the colonies. The people in Massachusetts, they could no longer make money to live. town meetings were also banned. Then the British government ordered the colonists to quarter British soldiers, meaning the colonists had to feed the soldiers and give them a place to sleep. The king also made General Thomas Gage the colonial governor of Massachusetts. Gage was head of the British Army in North America. In response to the new laws, colonists shouted, "Intolerable acts!" The new laws then became known as the Intolerable Acts. Unknown to the British, the committees of correspondence sent food and money to Boston. They were intolerable acts that we should have to bunk with the same ones who give us grief day in and day out. Why, it tears me something awful.
What's so funny? You mean you dumped the tea?
Yep. Biggest cup of tea in history, I figure.
The British must have been really mad.
It was time to act, though. Many colonists, well, they believed the British government may try to use its army to make them obey the laws. In September of 1774, in Philadelphia, the committees of correspondence called a meeting of representatives of all the colonies to decide what to do. Representatives from every colony except Georgia, they came to the meeting. The gathering of these representatives was called the Continental Congress. Well, they all agreed to stop all trade with Britain unless Parliament abolished the Intolerable Acts. They said that the colonies would no longer obey British laws when the laws took away their liberty as citizens. Congress agreed that if the demands for colonial rights weren't met, it would meet again in May 1775 to decide what to do next. They asked colonists to gather men to defend the cities. They called themselves Minutemen because they had to be ready to fight in a minute's notice. Well, the House of Burgesses, which was a governing body in Virginia, suggested the colonists prepare for war. And then Patrick Henry gave his most famous speech in March of 1775. He stated, "I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Now, Massachusetts had become an armed camp. Well, the British kept their soldiers and weapons ready, and the colonists who were against the British now called themselves patriots. In April 1775, British General Thomas Gage, the new governor of Massachusetts, well, he heard that the Patriots were storing weapons in the town of Concord near Boston. He also heard that John Hancock and Samuel Adams, two leaders of the Sons of Liberty, were staying in the nearby village of Lexington. The general, he sent 700 British soldiers to find the weapons and arrest the Patriot leaders. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott, all members of the Sons of Liberty. They rode out on the night of April 18th to warn Hancock and Adams that the British are coming. Unfortunately, a British patrol caught up with them. The patrol took Revere's horse, but Dawes, he escaped. Only Prescott reached Concord. When the British arrived in Lexington on April 19th, they found Minutemen waiting for them. Shots were fired and 8 Minutemen were killed. The British then marched on to Concord, but the weapons, they had been moved. Because the Minutemen were outnumbered, they waited for reinforcements as the soldiers searched the town. Then, as the British soldiers marched back to Boston, they were shot at by Minutemen from the woods and fields beside the road. The British lost 73 men and 174 were wounded. Of the 4,000 Minutemen at Lexington and Concord, 93 were killed or wounded. The shots fired at Lexington marked the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Well, just yonder, that's Lexington. And over there, that's Concord.
So that's where it all started.
Aye. And we still have a long way to go, too. Them British are sharp fellas.
I think things will turn out pretty good.
I believe you, little Miss Little Lady. I believe you.
Ben! Ben, where are you?
Hear what? What were you just saying?
Nothing.
Oh, did you try that fife out like I told you? Did it tell you any stories? Yeah, many stories. They're important stories. I'll tell you what, why don't you hang on to that? It doesn't really work like it used to when I was young.
Gee, thanks, Dad.
Oh, that's all right. Come on in now. Let's go eat some lunch. You can practice after you eat. Maybe it'll tell you some more stories.